14th January, 1943. Western Pocket, Stalingrad. The German officer couldn't feel his feet anymore. Hauptmann Werner Schulz sat in what had once been a bakery cellar, now a makeshift command post lit by a single candle stub. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -37 degrees Celsius. His breath formed ice crystals in the air that tinkled when they fell. Around him, 43 men, all that remained of his company, huddled against walls blackened by fires they could no longer light. They had no fuel, no wood, nothing left to burn except the frozen corpses stacked like cordwood in the corner. And even the hungrier men had stopped looking at those. Schulz pulled his threadbare coat tighter, feeling the gaps where he'd cut strips of fabric to wrap around his hands. He'd eaten his last piece of bread 3 days ago, a portion the size of a matchbox. His stomach had stopped growling. That was a bad sign. One of the men near the wall had stopped breathing during the night, simply freezing to death in his sleep. No one had noticed until morning. Above them, the rhythmic thump of Soviet artillery continued its deadly metronome. The shells were getting closer. Schulz knew they were coming. Everyone knew. The question wasn't if they would die, but how. From a bullet, from starvation, or from the cold that had already killed more Germans than all the Soviet guns combined. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War. Where are you watching from? And could you survive what these men endured? 6 months earlier, the German Sixth Army was the pride of the Wehrmacht, a force of over 270,000 battle-hardened soldiers who had conquered Poland, crushed resistance in France, and swept across the Soviet Union with the confidence of an unstoppable machine. Led by General Paulus, a meticulous strategist and staff officer who had helped orchestrate the invasion of Poland, the Sixth Army represented everything Nazi Germany's military-industrial complex could produce. Elite panzer divisions equipped with Mark III and Mark IV tanks, mechanized infantry units mounted in half-tracks, artillery regiments with thousands of guns, and the full support of the Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps 8. Their objective in the summer of 1942 was clear and ambitious: capture Stalingrad, the industrial city sprawling along the western bank of the Volga River, and then drive south to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus. Without oil, Stalin's war machine would grind to a halt. Soviet tanks would become immobile monuments. Aircraft would rust on their runways. The entire Red Army would collapse. Hitler believed Stalingrad was the key to winning the Eastern Front, and he wanted it badly, not just for strategic reasons, but because it bore his enemy's name. Taking Stalin City would be both military victory and propaganda triumph. The offensive began on 23 August 1942 with a Luftwaffe bombing campaign that transformed Stalingrad into an inferno. Over 600 aircraft, Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, Heinkel He-111 medium bombers, and Dornier Do-17s attacked in waves throughout the day. They dropped over 1,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs on a city built largely of wood. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 40,000 civilians in a single afternoon. Entire neighborhoods vanished. The Volga River itself seemed to burn as oil storage tanks ruptured and spilled their contents into the water. Survivors emerged from cellars to find their city transformed into a landscape of ash and rubble, with flames still consuming what remained. German ground forces crossed the Don River and pushed toward the city with characteristic efficiency. The 14th and 24th Panzer Divisions led the assault, their tanks crushing Soviet defensive positions. Behind them came wave after wave of infantry, young men from Hamburg, Munich, and Berlin, many of whom had never experienced a Russian winter and couldn't imagine what was coming. They sang marching songs and wrote confident letters home. One lance corporal from Stuttgart wrote to his mother, "We will be in Stalingrad within a week. The Russians are beaten. I will be home for Christmas." He would never see home again. None of them would. What the Germans didn't understand was that Stalingrad represented something different to the Soviet Union. This wasn't just another city to defend. Stalin had issued Order Number 227 on 28 July 1942, not one step back. The decree was absolute and brutal. Retreat without orders meant execution. Officers who withdrew would face military tribunals. Entire units could be disbanded and sent to penal battalions, Strafbats, where men were used as human minesweepers or thrown into suicidal frontal assaults. The message was clear: defend or die. There was no third option. General Vasily Trikov took command of the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad on 12 September, when German forces had already reached the city's outskirts. Trikov was a veteran of the Russian Civil War, a survivor of Stalin's purges, and a man who understood that conventional tactics wouldn't work here. The Germans excelled at mobile warfare, at using their tanks and Stukas to blast holes in defensive lines, and then exploiting those breaches with mechanized infantry. They were masters of the battlefield when they could see their enemy across open ground. But Stalingrad offered no open ground. The Luftwaffe bombing had transformed it into a maze of rubble, collapsed buildings, and twisted metal. Trikov made a calculated decision. He would turn the city into a close-quarters killing ground where German advantages evaporated. He ordered his troops to hug the Germans, stay so close to enemy positions that German artillery and air support couldn't be used without hitting their own men. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a shooting gallery. Every basement became a bunker. The fighting that followed was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had experienced. In Poland and France, battles lasted days or weeks. In Stalingrad, battles lasted months for single buildings. The grain elevator, a massive concrete structure near the river, was defended by a small Soviet garrison for 5 days against repeated German assaults supported by tanks and flamethrowers. When German forces finally broke in, they found the garrison had been wiped out to the last man, their bodies scattered among piles of spent shell casings. The Germans had lost over 100 men to take one building.
Pavlov's house became legendary. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his platoon, a mix of Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Kazakhs, and Uzbeks representing the multi-ethnic Soviet state, occupied a 4-story apartment building and held it for 58 days. They fortified every window with sandbags and machine guns. They planted mines around the building's perimeter. They knocked holes through internal walls to move between rooms without exposing themselves to sniper fire. They dug a communication trench to the Volga for supplies and reinforcements. German infantry attacked repeatedly, sometimes with tank support. They never took the building. Soviet propaganda later claimed that more Germans died attacking Pavlov's house than died taking Paris, an exaggeration, but one that captured the savage intensity of the fighting. One German soldier, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria, wrote in his diary, "We have fought for 15 days for a single house with mortars, grenades, machine guns, and bayonets. Already by the 3rd day, 54 German corpses are strewn in the cellars, on the landings, and the staircases. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. It is the thin ceiling between 2 floors. Help comes from neighboring houses by fire escapes and chimneys. There is a ceaseless struggle from noon to night.
From story to story, faces black with sweat, we bombard each other with grenades in the middle of explosions, clouds of dust and smoke, heaps of mortar, floods of blood, fragments of furniture and human beings. Ask any soldier what half an hour of hand-to-hand struggle means in such a fight, and imagine Stalingrad, 80 days and 80 nights of hand-to-hand struggles. The street is no longer measured by meters, but by corpses. By October 1942, Stalingrad had been reduced to skeletal ruins. The Red October steel factory, the Barricadi gun factory, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, which had been converted to produce T-34 tanks, were all contested zones where Soviet workers fought alongside soldiers, sometimes rolling tanks directly from assembly lines into combat. The fighting in these industrial complexes was particularly hellish. Furnaces still glowed in some sections while men killed each other in others. Machine shops became sniper nests. Assembly halls became killing grounds where soldiers fired at muzzle flashes in the darkness. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. Soldiers on both sides lived like vermin in the ruins, scavenging for food, drinking water contaminated with chemicals and blood, sleeping in shifts because falling asleep completely meant waking up dead or not waking up at all. Disease spread rapidly through the close quarters. Dysentery became epidemic. Lice infested every uniform. Typhus followed, killing the sick and the wounded who might have otherwise recovered. But it was the approaching winter that would prove deadlier than all the bullets and bombs combined. The first snow fell in late October, light flurries that melted on the still warm rubble. By November, the temperature was dropping steadily. German soldiers, equipped for a summer campaign that was supposed to end in victory before winter, began to realize they were catastrophically unprepared. They wore standard-issue wool uniforms designed for Central European weather, not the savage cold of a Russian winter. They had no proper winter coats, no insulated boots, no cold-weather gear beyond what they could scavenge from dead Soviet soldiers. Wehrmacht logistics stretched over 1,000 kilometers of supply lines from Germany through Poland and Ukraine couldn't deliver what didn't exist. Winter clothing was still being manufactured in Germany, scheduled to arrive in December. Fuel for vehicles and heating was rationed. Food shipments became irregular as partisan attacks increased on rail lines. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the skies in August, found its sortie rates dropping as fog, snow, and freezing temperatures grounded aircraft or limited flight windows to a few hours per day. Paulus requested permission to withdraw from Stalingrad and establish a winter defensive line further west. Hitler refused. The Führer had publicly declared that Stalingrad would fall. He had promised the German people victory. Retreat was politically impossible. On 19th November, Hitler sent a message to Paulus, "Hold at all costs. The Sixth Army will remain in Stalingrad." That same day, everything changed. At 7:20 a.m. on 19th November 1942, the frozen steppe north of Stalingrad erupted with fire. Over 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously along an 80-kilometer front. The barrage lasted 80 minutes, a rolling thunder that shattered Romanian defensive positions, destroyed communication trenches, and sent shells screaming into command posts and supply depots. Romanian soldiers, equipped with outdated weapons and holding positions their German allies considered secondary, broke under the onslaught. At 8:50 a.m., Soviet armor emerged from the snow. Hundreds of T-34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks crashed through what remained of the Romanian lines. The T-34, with its sloped armor and superior mobility in winter conditions, was more than a match for German Panzer IIIs and even most Panzer IVs. Romanian anti-tank guns, dating back to World War I, were useless against Soviet armor. Within hours, the northern front had collapsed. Soviet mobile units raced southwest, bypassing German strongpoints, cutting communication lines, overrunning supply depots. The next day, 20th November, the nightmare repeated in the south. Another massive artillery barrage pulverized Romanian positions south of Stalingrad. More Soviet tanks broke through. German reserves rushed to plug the gaps, but they were too few, too late, and running out of fuel. Panzer divisions that should have been able to maneuver at speed found themselves crawling on fumes, their tanks abandoned when fuel ran out. By 23 November 1942, the two Soviet pincers met near Koloch, 40 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The trap snapped shut. The entire German Sixth Army, over 290,000 men, was encircled in a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. With them were remnants of Romanian divisions, Croatian auxiliaries, and Luftwaffe ground personnel operating flak batteries. All were cut off from supplies, from reinforcements, from any hope of rescue. Inside the pocket, the situation deteriorated with shocking speed. Paulus's quartermaster calculated that the army needed a minimum of 500 tons of supplies daily to sustain combat operations: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, and winter clothing. Reichsmarschall Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, personally assured the Führer that his air force could deliver those supplies. He promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe had successfully supplied encircled forces before and could do so again. It was perhaps the most consequential lie of the entire war.
The Luftwaffe did not have 500 tons of daily airlift capacity into Stalingrad. The distances were too great. The weather was too unpredictable. Soviet fighters patrolled the air corridors. Anti-aircraft batteries ringed the pocket. The airfields inside the pocket were under constant artillery bombardment. Transport aircraft, primarily Junkers Ju-52s, the same three-engine transports that had dropped paratroopers over Crete, were designed for cargo, not for flying through blizzards and fighter attacks. On good days, the airlift delivered 100 tons. On most days, it delivered less than 50. On many days, nothing at all reached the pocket. Ju-52s were shot down in droves. Soviet Yak-1 and Lag-3 fighters hunted them mercilessly. One Soviet pilot described it as shooting fat geese. They are slow, lumbering, and they cannot fight back. Over 500 transport aircraft would be lost trying to supply the Sixth Army. Their wreckage littered the snow-covered steppe, metal monuments to Germany's strategic failure. Inside the pocket, soldiers' daily rations were cut to 300 grams of bread, then 200 grams, then 100 grams, a slice the size of a man's palm. Horses were slaughtered for meat, over 30,000 of them, until none remained. Then soldiers began eating anything organic they could find. Leather belts were boiled to make a glutinous soup. Grass was chewed for fiber. Men scraped frost from walls to drink because the water supplies had frozen solid. By December, starvation was killing as efficiently as Soviet bullets. A German infantryman's body, designed to operate on 3,000 calories per day during combat conditions, was receiving perhaps 700 calories. Muscle mass disappeared first. Fat reserves, already depleted by months of combat, vanished entirely. The body began consuming itself, breaking down organs for energy. Men became skeletal. Their eyes sank into their skulls. Their uniforms hung loose on frames that had once been strong and healthy. But the cold was worse than the hunger. Much worse. December brought temperatures that plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius and kept falling. Minus 35, minus 40. On the worst nights, minus 45. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath freezes in the lungs. Metal becomes so cold that touching it with bare skin tears the flesh away. Weapons malfunction as lubricants turn to sludge. Vehicle engines refuse to start no matter how long mechanics work on them.
German soldiers, still wearing their summer uniforms with perhaps one additional layer of clothing scavenged from dead comrades, were dying of exposure by the thousands. Frostbite became epidemic. Fingers and toes turned black with necrosis. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper, in rags torn from dead men's clothing, in anything that might provide insulation. It didn't help. The cold found its way through every barrier. Field hospitals, primitive aid stations set up in cellars and ruined buildings filled with frostbite casualties. Surgeons performed amputations by candlelight, sawing through frozen tissue without anesthesia because medical supplies had run out. Men screamed as blackened toes and fingers were removed. Many died from shock or infection. The lucky ones survived as cripples, unable to hold a rifle, unable to walk, but still trapped in the pocket with no way out. One Wehrmacht doctor, writing in his journal, described conditions. More and more soldiers are losing toes and fingers to frostbite. We have stopped counting the amputations. The screaming never stops. We have no morphine left. We have no bandages. We have no ointments. All I can do is saw off the dead tissue and hope they don't die from infection or blood loss. Most do. They die quietly, too weak to even cry out. Yesterday, a boy from Hamburg, no more than 19, asked me to cut off his feet. Both were black to the ankles. I refused. I told him we had to wait, that perhaps they could be saved. He took his pistol and shot himself through the temple. I don't blame him. Sleep became a form of Russian roulette. Soldiers knew that falling asleep in the open meant freezing to death. They huddled together for warmth, pressed body to body in cellars and ruins, sharing body heat because they had no other source. Even so, men would wake to find the soldier next to them had died during the night, frozen solid. Those who died were stripped of their clothing immediately. The living needed those extra layers more than the dead needed dignity. Fuel was so scarce that vehicles couldn't run. Tanks sat immobile, their engines frozen, their crews sheltering inside the halls, which provided at least some protection from the wind. Artillery pieces couldn't be moved. Horses that hadn't been eaten froze to death standing upright. Soldiers burned furniture, then structural beams from buildings, then anything wood they could find. When the wood ran out, they tried burning uniforms, leather, even frozen corpses soaked in fuel, anything to create heat for even a few minutes. The psychological toll was immense. Men watched their friends die slowly from starvation and cold. They listened to Soviet propaganda broadcasts promising warm meals and medical care for those who surrendered. They received letters from home that described Christmas celebrations, warm houses, children opening presents, letters that described a world that no longer seemed real. Some men committed suicide rather than continue. Others simply gave up, stopped eating what little they had, stopped fighting, and waited for death. On Christmas Day 1942, the temperature inside the pocket dropped to minus 38 degrees Celsius. There were no celebrations, no songs, no traditional meals. Soldiers sat in frozen ruins and ate their 100-gram bread rations if they had been lucky enough to receive any. The Luftwaffe had attempted a special supply drop of Christmas packages, chocolates, cigarettes, small luxuries meant to boost morale. Less than a quarter of the packages made it through. Soviet fighters shot down several transports. Other planes dropped their cargo in the wrong locations, outside the pocket, where Soviet soldiers collected German Christmas packages and laughed. One German sergeant wrote in his diary that night, "Christmas in hell. Fritz died today, just sat down against the wall and never got up. We left him there because we are too weak to move his body. Tomorrow we will cut strips from his uniform to wrap our feet. God forgive us. God forgive Germany for sending us here."
By early January 1943, the pocket had shrunk dramatically. Soviet forces attacked relentlessly from all sides, using artillery barrages followed by infantry and tank assaults.
German defenders, weakened by starvation and cold, could barely hold their positions. Ammunition was running critically low. Machine gunners were issued 50 rounds per day, not enough to repel a determined assault. Soldiers were told to conserve bullets, to let the enemy hit close before firing. The airfield at Pitomnik, the main supply drop zone, fell to Soviet forces on 16 January. The last remaining airfield, Gumrak, was captured on 22 January. Now even the trickle of supplies stopped completely. The Sixth Army was sealed in its tomb, cut off from the outside world, dying by degrees. Wehrmacht command in Germany issued increasingly desperate orders. Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal on 30 January, the implication being that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, and therefore Paulus should commit suicide rather than be captured. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels prepared speeches describing the Sixth Army's heroic sacrifice for the fatherland. Plans were made for a national day of mourning. Inside the pocket, such grand pronouncements meant nothing. Soldiers were past caring about heroism or propaganda. They cared only about survival, about making it through the next hour, the next day. But survival was no longer possible. On 31 January 1943, Friedrich Paulus sat in the basement of the Unemag department store, which had become the Sixth Army's final headquarters. Above him, Soviet tanks were clearing the last blocks of German resistance. Around him, his staff officers waited in silence. Outside, the temperature had dropped again, minus 42 degrees Celsius. The wind howled through shattered windows, carrying with it the sound of gunfire growing ever closer. Paulus had received Hitler's message promoting him to field marshal. He understood what it meant. He was expected to die here, either in battle or by his own hand, rather than surrender and face the humiliation of captivity. For hours, Paulus sat in silence, weighing his options. He thought of the 91,000 men still alive in the pocket, starving, freezing, waiting for orders. He thought of the hundreds of thousands already dead. He thought of the promises of relief that never came, the supplies that never arrived, the support that evaporated like frost in sunlight. At 7:35 a.m., Paulus surrendered his southern pocket to Soviet forces. 2 days later, the northern pocket surrendered as well. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 290,000 Germans encircled, approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. But survival was relative. They were skeletal, disease-ridden, frostbitten, and broken. Soviet POW camps, themselves struggling with insufficient supplies and brutal conditions, became death camps for the Germans. Over the following months, thousands more died from typhus, dysentery, malnutrition, and untreated frostbite injuries. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Most didn't make it past 1943. They had survived the battle, only to die slowly in captivity. The Soviet Union counted its own catastrophic losses. An estimated 478,000 Soviet soldiers died during the battle, with over 1 million wounded. Civilian casualties in Stalingrad approached 50,000. The city itself was obliterated. Not a single building remained intact. The industrial factories that Stalin had fought so desperately to hold were twisted wreckage. The streets were mass graves that wouldn't be fully cleared for years. But the strategic impact was seismic. Germany had lost an entire army, one of its finest, most experienced forces. The Sixth Army simply ceased to exist. 22 divisions, hundreds of thousands of men who had marched confidently across Europe, were gone. The equipment losses were staggering. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, mountains of rifles and machine guns. It was a blow from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. More importantly, Stalingrad broke the myth of German invincibility.
The blitzkrieg that had terrified Europe was stopped, surrounded, and destroyed. Soviet morale soared. Stalin's desperate gamble to hold the city at all costs had paid off. From Stalingrad forward, the strategic initiative belonged to the Red Army. The Wehrmacht would fight desperately for 2 more years, inflicting terrible casualties, but it would be fighting a defensive war, retreating westward across thousands of kilometers, bleeding itself white in a war of attrition it could not win. Today, the ruins of Stalingrad have been rebuilt as Volgograd. Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that changed hands so many times, is crowned with a massive memorial. The Motherland Calls, an 85-meter statue visible for miles. Beneath that statue, in the soil churned by millions of shells, workers still occasionally find relics, bullets, helmets, dog tags, and bones. Both German and Soviet, they lie together in the earth, united in death, if not in life. The battle lasted 199 days. From the first Luftwaffe bombs on 23 August 1942 to the final surrender on 2 February 1943, Stalingrad consumed everything thrown at it. It became a frozen hell where Hitler's elite army learned that courage, training, and superior equipment meant nothing against starvation, cold, and the mathematics of encirclement. The soldiers who died there, German and Soviet alike, didn't die for ideology or grand strategy. They died because they were there, trapped in a battle neither side could abandon, fighting for streets that no longer existed, over ruins that held no value except as symbols. They died of hunger in a pocket that received supply flights but not enough supplies. They died of cold because no one had planned for winter. They died because generals and dictators made decisions in warm rooms thousands of miles away, decisions that seemed reasonable on maps, but were death sentences on the ground. Stalingrad stands as a monument, not to the glory of war, but to its absolute horror, to what happens when human beings are ground up between the machines of total war and the indifference of winter. But even as the frozen ruins of Stalingrad still smoldered with the last embers of Hitler's ambition, another battlefront was opening far to the south, one where young American soldiers would face their baptism for fire against Rommel's Afrika Korps. Join us next time as we uncover the brutal lessons learned at Kasserine Pass, where the U.S. Army discovered that courage alone wasn't enough to win a modern war.